Holy angels with power over all the doings of Diana, whose power and office it is to alter wills and thoughts, to prepare journeys, to deliver messages, to provoke rains, I conjure you, I beseech you by the one who created you from pure light, and established you in such power and knowledge.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are so excited to talk about Planetary Orations with scholar and translator Brian Johnson. So what are some of the earliest grimoiric recordings from nearly 700 years ago of detailed conjurations and names of planets, of angels, specific names of the days of the week and seasons that magicians all needed for successful operations? Well, Brian Johnson is one of the best people to ask. He's a translator, a transcriber, a humanities scholar, a freelance editor, and a writer. Brian's previous publications include Necromancy in the Medici Library, about a 15th century grimoire, and he's also translated 15th century Byzantine Greek manuscripts of the Testament of Solomon, which really added more context to the place of Solomon in grimoiric magic. Brian's latest work from Hadean Press is a translation and commentary entitled Naming the Heavens, Orations from the Summa Sacra Magicae, which presents a series of prayers and ritual inscriptions from the mid-1300s addressed to the spirits of the heavenly bodies and facilitated via the invocation of those names, by which the hours, days, months, and signs are called in each season of the year. All of this intended to secure for oneself general protection and good fortune in any undertaking. This massive grimoire compendium, the Summa Sacra Magicae, or Magicae, or SSM as it's known, is an incredibly important tome because it details among the earliest attestations we have to what is known as the Solomonic grimoiric magical tradition. And within the pages of the SSM, we have content, rituals, exorcisms, and spirit names, many of which are found in other well-known grimoires like the Sworn Book of Honorius and the Heptameron. So Brian is one of the best people to ask about the context and importance of the Summa. So thanks to Brian for joining us today, and to every Glitch Bottle patron and supporter of the podcast on Patreon for your excellent questions for Brian as well. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back Brian Johnson. Brian Johnson, thank you so much for stopping back again on the Glitch Bottle podcast.
Thank you for having me back. Always a pleasure.
Brian, the honor is certainly mine. I know I join the listeners that we get so excited when you share a new publication, because as a scholar and as someone who has a strong affinity for esoteric presentations, it is a true honor. And I guess the best place to start, Brian, is can you share with the listeners what was the genesis of wanting to actually translate these specific portions of the SSM? This is just such a massive tome. What was the beginning of that for you?
So most of the people that I've seen talking about the SSM seem to be primarily concerned with the ways that it might be able to kind of help clarify or in some way complete the Liber Iuratus, or Sworn Book of Honorius, especially in terms of some of its preparatory prayers, as much of the text is actually an alternate and probably earlier recension of the Honorius material. So, of course, I immediately ignored all that and went off to explore some anomalous tangent on planetary supplications. But seriously, I had been asked by a colleague to translate a short section of the manuscript for a project that they're working on. And in doing so, I familiarized myself with the table of contents. Now, I'm personally interested in various forms of astral and astrological magic. So chapter titles like De Orationibus Planetarum immediately caught my attention, and I decided to see what they were all about. I concluded that these planetary orations, along with the cosmological names that they refer to, once I'd also located those in the manuscript, could actually be used independent of the SSM's larger framework. So I went about putting all the pieces together into a little handbook. My working principle has always kind of been that if I think something seems useful or interesting, I'm probably not the only one. So why not share it?
Spider-Man may have spidey sense, but I can only imagine your scholar sense when you read things like De Orationibus Planetarum. Like, absolutely. Brian, as well, you do such an amazing job in your commentary and translation, laying out some of the context behind the SSM, the Summa itself. Can you share with us a little bit about the history? Who was this character, Berengario Gannel, and what was the context in which the SSM was written in Europe in 1346? What were some of the big things going on?
So Gannel was a scholar working in Catalonia during the early to mid 14th century, and some traces of the regional vernacular in his Latin usage would seem to suggest that he was either a native of the area or at least had resided there for quite some time. He appears at one point to have been in the service of James III of Majorca, living at his castle Trasor in Perpignan. And it's actually in this connection that one of the few biographical notices pertaining to him actually comes to our attention. There was a friar named Stephanus Pipini who was put on trial for sorcery in 1347. And he attested that the Chamberlain of James had put him in touch with Gannel, who let Stephanus study his copy of the Liberatus. Beyond that, we don't really have any concrete details of Gannel's life or activities. Now, the region that is now called Catalonia had been relatively briefly part of the Umayyad province of Al-Andalus since the year 718, but by the end of the 8th century had more or less been reconquered by the Franks and made part of what was called the Spanish March. By the time Gannel was active, Andalusia as such had been reduced to the region in the vicinity of Granada on the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, though, of course, this didn't mean that Arabic culture had been extinguished in areas further north, like the Catalonian Principality. It remained a border region for several centuries, and many of the ecclesiastical libraries there retained Arabic manuscripts that pertain to, quote unquote, scientific subjects, including astrology, to say nothing of, intellectual interchange among Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars in person at various population centers on the peninsula, like Toledo.
To that point, Brian, in addition to that context, you mentioned in your presentation that Gannel specifically considered magic as, quote, an act of worship, unquote. This is fascinating. Can you share a little bit about where Gannel was coming from?
Well, from my own study of the Summa, as well as those of scholars like Damaris Guerre, who have much more extensively examined the entire text than I have, my impression is that for Gannel, magic is both dependent upon as well as a confirmation and demonstration of the magician's own faith, specifically the Christian faith, which is a point that Gannel harps on rather frequently throughout the text. For example, at one point, he says, quote, and this is my translation, obviously, magic deals with wonder-working words swarming out of faith or proceeding from firm belief so that one believes in the true God. And then he goes on to say later that it's better if one believes in the Christian faith because the others are, quote, worthless straw. So it's hard not to get the sense that as much cultural intercourse and exchange as there may have been on the Iberian Peninsula at that time, there was still an overwhelming sense of anxiety and competition between Christendom and Islam. But in any case, the nature of the central program, if you will, of the SSM much like that of the Liber Iuratus text, which it evidently draws from extensively, is essentially one of Christian theurgy, involving preparatory supplications and purifications, the consecration of a sigillum Dei or sigil of God, and ultimately receiving a divine vision, absolving one's sins, and also various peripheral operations of more or less utilitarian nature, like commanding infernal spirits and whatnot, which were more or less dependent upon first accomplishing that central theurgic experience.
You mentioned that the Summa Sacra Magicae, this SSM, is, quote, a densely intratextual as well as an intertextual work. Can you share about how the SSM references itself and other works like the Sworn Book of Honorius and the Book of Raziel or Liber Razialis?
Sure. So Gannel lays out his magical methodology in what might charitably be called a very discursive manner. Again, much like the Sworn Book, which would more or less require one to read almost the entire treatise to make effective use of it. And I have absolutely not done so. However, to give just an example based on my own work concerning the planetary prayers, whereas the orations of the spirits of the planets appear in chapter 3 of the second tractate of book 2, those orations call for the name of the planet in question, as well as the current day, hour, season, month, zodiac sign, and decan in which the planet is being invoked, all of which change according to the current season. And to find this information, one has to look back to chapters 1 through 4 of the second tractate of book 1, where they can be found incorporated into a series of equally meandering texts titled On the Conjuration of the Witnesses of the Seasons. So, in order to make this material actually usable, I went and extracted all of the relevant names and arranged them in a series of tables for each season, which can then be easily referenced for the time at which one wishes to perform a given oration. Primary to the text, the SSM incorporates material from what appears to be something like what we might call an text that underlies what has elsewhere come down to us as the Sworn Book of Honorius, and was probably composed between the late 13th and early 14th century itself, so not long before the SSM. The Sworn Book as we know it today apparently comprises something of a later recension and reorganization of some of the ritual program as it's laid out in the SSM. The Sworn Book, for example, replaces a series of orations called the Liber Trium Animarum, or Book of Three Souls, in the SSM, with prayers taken from the Ars Notoria instead. And some of its other elements, such as the method of deriving the 72-letter name of God, are kind of opaque without the more complete text found in the SSM. The Summa also adds some practical details that are not part of the later recension of the Sworn Book. For instance, the circle for calling aerial and planetary spirits described in the Liber Iuratus, I believe it's section 114. It requires the names of the angels of the hour, day, month, time, and aspect, which are not directly identified as such anywhere in that text. They are, however, supplied in Book 1 of the SSM, which, as I mentioned, is likewise the source for the names called for in the orations in Book 2. Also, like the Sworn Book, many of the names assigned to the entities comprising the cosmic hierarchy appear to ultimately derive from some part of the Liber Razialis tradition, which incorporated various Arabic and Jewish sources via Greek and Latin translations, though the Sworn Book and SSM appear to differ enough that they were clearly drawing upon different prototype texts within that larger corpus. The Raziel tradition and Sworn Book / SSM are also both in a way concerned with the sanctification of the human person who makes use of them, though this is somewhat more of an implicit benefit of cosmological knowledge conferred by the former and more of a specific operative program in the latter. Incidentally, as far as I can tell, both of these textual traditions appear to be largely independent of the spirit names in either the Greek hygromantia or the texts attributed to Apollonius of Tyana.
That is so fascinating, Brian. So listeners who know a little bit about or who practice from the Liber Iuratus or they look at Sefer Raziel, this is the SSM, just such a key text that sheds so much light on that. And in terms of that theme, Brian, in terms of context, we have two listener questions for you that touch on the same themes. One is from Mickle J, who is asking, yes, we can use these in our rituals, such as drawing spirits into crystals, but what is suggested that these prayers provide, these orations in SSM? Another question for you is from Ted Orville, who is asking, Brian, do all of these orations and talismanic purifications fit into a much larger ceremonial magical operation in SSM?
They do. Much like many of the grimoire texts concerned with spirit conjuration, there's an implicit concern expressed throughout many of the orations and prayers in the SSM that demonic forces may tempt or endanger the magician. And Gannel states that these particular orations and purifications are intended, and I can quote him here, so that no evil spirit is able to oppose your work nor cast any hidden evil in your path. So it seems Gannel felt that these orations should be incorporated as part of the overall performance of the Honorius ritual as he envisioned it, though obviously I believe they should also be effective on their own terms, independent of any particular ceremony.
To that point, Brian, what are some of these magical names, spirits, and goals, quote unquote, of the operation as it's contained in Tractate 2, Book 2 of the Summa?
So the goal, as we just mentioned, is essentially to secure the protection and assistance of the spirits/angels associated with a particular planet, specifically the planet corresponding to the present day of the week, all in the course of some undertaking, probably, but not necessarily a magical operation. Each of the orations actually finishes with the phrase, quote, in tali re and the letter N, as in name something here, which I've translated this phrase basically as in the matter of insert your wishes here. The names appearing in each of the orations are those of the planets and their angels themselves. Their precise origins are varied. Some are clearly Hebrew or Arabic. Others are somewhat more obscure. But given the correspondences identified for some of the other names found in the SSM, as well, for lack of a better way to characterize them, their morphology and phonetic structure, many probably derive from some form of a Raziel text. I've actually found a series of prayers in a 16th century manuscript. It's cataloged as Handschrift 1410 in the Darmstadt Library, which are actually rather analogous to the orations of the planets in the SSM and also use very similar names. The other names that I mentioned are those that correspond to the day, hour, etc., in which the oration is made, which, as I also discussed before, are those found in the preceding book of the SSM. And I've compared these with the Raziel text found in Vatican manuscript Regius Latinus 1300, which I think is the earliest extant Latin manuscript of that text. And again, there are numerous correspondences between them, but at the same time, it's clear that Gannel was not copying from precisely that version of the text.
So for those listeners who are familiar, for example, in the Heptameron, where it says you should name the moon in the specific season of summer or autumn, or the earth, or the specific name of the sun, the SSM and this amazing context you're providing, Brian, really does have this much more massively expanded body of nomina magica and ritual procedure for calling these entities. And you, Brian, kick off your selected translation with the purification of the planets, where for each planet and day of the week, the operator needs to write specific names and carry these names on their actual person, on their body for protection. Can you elaborate a little more on, are these names seen as talismanic in their application? Or if you can share anything that struck you about this chapter as you were going through it and translating it.
Yeah, you could call them talismans, or maybe more properly, in the technical sense, amulets, as they seem to be specifically protective devices. A couple of the things that did stand out to me as kind of unique in this particular chapter, the names are apparently to be written with inks particular to each planet. And if that is the intent, the way it's phrased is not absolutely clear. But if that is the case, then I have not identified these instructions for making such inks elsewhere in the SSM. They may very well be there. It's an extremely large book. But I've speculated that the idea may be that infusing the ink with either incense ingredients or other materia corresponding to the planet in question may be, if not Gannel's intent, at least a suitable method of preparing it. The other thing was that a couple of the series of names to be inscribed are followed by these brief phrases, one of which is identical to the incipit of the Latin Mass for the Dead. Now, it's not at all clear why these were included, and only in 2 cases, but I do know that particular liturgical chants were sometimes cited in much this way to indicate a particular melodic setting, which may imply something about how these names are supposed to be intoned as they're being inscribed. Now, again, this is just my hypothesis, but it's very thought-provoking.
Brian, as well, in chapter 2, you present in your translation and commentary the orations of the planets. This is such a beautiful section where specific orations are made to the planets themselves, with each planet being ruled by a spirit and a unique set of magical names of nomina magica that are used to conjure the planet to grant goodwill and virtue to the operator. Can you share any context around these orations of the planets?
So each of these orations, it addresses its planet by more or less praising its qualities and virtues, all in rather general language, really. But they do touch upon both the characteristics of the planet itself as a visible object in the sky, as well as its traditional astrological attributes. For example, Mercury is said to mingle with every quality and grant every knowledge and all there is to know. And Saturn is placed high in the 7th heaven in a slow, lofty orbit, is cold and dry, and also makes men infirm by long and burdensome illnesses.
Brian, I know there might be a lot of people right now saying, okay, what do these orations sound like? And so after the oration to the planet, chapter 3, you mention that and translate that the operator needs to immediately address the oration to the angelic beings surrounding each planet. So could you perhaps recite maybe a few lines or an entire oration to the planets? It's just so poetic in so many ways.
Sure. I thought what I might do is I can recite the text of the oration to the spirits of the moon. And then when I get to the section where it actually calls for the specific cosmological names, I can insert the proper names for our recording time right here, just to kind of demonstrate how this all kind of fits together. So, the oration of the angels of the moon. O high, bright, pure, elegant, propitious companions of the western region, O appearance tall and grand, O color dark and pale, like uncut crystal, or opaque ice or clouds, of the holy, blessed angels of Diana. O Gabriel, Michael, Samael, Achitael, Atiohel, Horpeniel, holy angels with power over all the doings of Diana, whose power and office it is to alter wills and thoughts, to prepare journeys, to deliver messages, to provoke rains. I conjure you, I beseech you by the one who created you from pure light and established you in such power and knowledge, and by the holy Semhamaphoros of the name, and by the glorious holy book of life, that all of you together in your household, and each individually, shall be confirmed directors and governors of that planet. And here I'll step back for a minute to explain how this all works. So the planet is obviously the moon, which for the current day and season takes the name Yaphas. And the day, Tuesday, has both a general name, which applies to both day and night, which is Kabar, and then an additional name for daytime hours specifically, which is Kat Guernadan. And let's see here. We are in the 7th hour of the day, which takes the name Yador. We are in the season of summer, which is Candesterepha. The year, according to Gannel's instructions, is simply Anno Domini 2022. The month of August is Azragap. The sign, which I take to mean the current rising sign, is Scorpio, which will be named Pazsan, and specifically in the second decan or face of that sign is ruled by the sun, which has the ruling angel Raphael. So after all of that, the oration finishes, so that you shall make for me a compliment and work in this undertaking concerning, and here you would name whatever your intent is.
Wow. Listeners, I hope you appreciate that as much as I do, because what you just heard, aside from the wonderful recitation, Brian, and thank you so much for reciting that, is also a beautiful example of how a magician would pick a time of an operation and then calculate the exact moment, the season, and then look up all of the specific names for the day of the week. Is it nighttime? Is it daytime? What is the rising sign? What are the angels? Brian, that was so beautiful. I think this next question, Brian, flows right into your recitation and sharing, because in the chapter 3 orations themselves, as you've intimated, we see variations of very familiar names that many listeners might be familiar with, names found in the Heptameron or the Elucidarium Necromantiae, or in CLM 849, which is the Munich manual translated by Dr. Richard Kickheffer in the 90s. Can you share any context around these specific names?
There are certainly names shared among these texts, but short of making any kind of a systematic index, trying to trace precisely how they all relate to one another is a pretty daunting task, which I have yet to attempt. The Heptameron's conjurations, pertaining to the days of the week rather than the planets per se, are naturally somewhat different in detail from the SSM, though their basic structure and purpose is pretty comparable. The Heptameron is much like a compressed and simplified version of the SSM or Liber Juratus method of invoking the planetary angels, and at the very least was drawing from a related tradition of some kind. For example, we can compare the SSM's oration of the Angels of Venus, where we have Anael, Rachiel, Salgoyel, Uriel, and Danael, to the Heptameron's considerations for the day of Friday, which also has Anael, Rachiel, albeit spelled differently, but no real correspondence for the others, unless Sachiel is an extremely garbled Salgoyel. CLM 849, meanwhile, mentions an Ade and Dagiel in its conjuration for Friday, but does name Anael as pertaining to Friday in a couple of other contexts, albeit among some more names that are not shared with the SSM either. Like I said, it's all rather confusingly mixed up.
I think that's what your wonderful presentation in your book from Hadean Press actually really adds. I know for me, a lot of that context, and the tables that you have are just great for looking up exactly what day of the year, what season, and who the angels are for working with them. And to that very point, Brian, we have a listener question for you from Tamam. And Tamam is asking and saying, "Hi, Brian. I love this translation that you present. My question is, the orations of the planets also contain massive amounts of astrological considerations, such as, quote, the governors of the first face of Aries belonging to Samael, the angel of Mars, unquote." And so Tamam is asking, Brian, can you please break down or share about some of the astrology behind these considerations? Thank you.
Sure. The astrology, such as it is in this part of the SSM, isn't actually of a highly complex nature. To kind of lay out how the decan rulership is worked out here, beginning with the first decan of Aries, since traditionally the year began with the sun entering Aries in the spring, so that's usually considered the first sign. Each decan is assigned a planetary ruler following the traditional Chaldean order. So the first decan of Aries is ruled by Mars, whose governing angel is Samael. Then we just continue around the zodiac with 3 decans per sign. So Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, then back to Saturn, Jupiter, Mars again, and repeat until we reach the end of the zodiac with Pisces, which coincidentally also ends up being ruled by Mars. All the spirits of the planets, I should mention, are also laid out in one of those tables in my appendix taken from that text in Book 1 of the SSM.
In your translating experience, have you ever seen anything as specific as in the SSM regarding these incredibly detailed and precise variations of seasons, of the names of the week, of the day, of the night, of the zodiac? Have you ever seen anything as specific as in the SSM?
The Liber Razielis and its larger kind of associated genre, from which most of these names seem to be derived, is certainly the most comprehensive way of treating this type of material that I'm familiar with in Western sources. Though I should say that the Chinese and Tibetan calendrical systems are probably even more complex in their own way. But that said, either Gannel or his source draw from a really fascinating array of Greco-Roman, Arabic, and Hebrew names. For instance, Saturn is given the name Al-Muqatil, which is simply an archaic Arabic name for that planet. Elsewhere, the name of the Roman goddess Proserpine is used to identify the moon in a couple of places.
As well, Brian, we have another listener question for you from Black Market Droidsmith, and I love that name. Black Market Droidsmith is asking, I have a question for Brian about the Summa Sacra Magicae. Is it possible to stack this with the Arbitel, or should they both, the Arbitel and the Summa Sacra, be kept as separate operations? Thank you.
Well, assuming that we're speaking specifically about the planetary orations and not the whole broader ritual program that's derived from Honorius, I certainly don't see any reason, either theoretically or practically, that one couldn't append the relevant prayer to the invocation of the Olympic spirit as it's found in aphorism 21 of the Arbitel. For what it's worth, they both explicitly assume a Christian metaphysics, if that's an important consideration for you. So it would be nothing if not consistent.
So, Brian, you've been laying out for us this amazing context regarding the specifics of the SSM, the selected translation of these chapters. Can you share with us kind of big picture for the listeners out there? What is the legacy of the Summa Sacra Magicae or SSM? And what is not only the legacy, but its massive importance to later grimoires?
Well, the SSM was probably most directly influential for later magical works in general. as the source of the Sigillum Dei, which served as the model for John Dee's own Sigil of God, albeit significantly altered in his alphabetic content and details by he and Ed Kelly. Dee had actually owned the SSM manuscript, now kept and also digitized by the Castle University Library, which was the particular manuscript that I worked from in making this translation. But the funny thing is, Gannel's book per se does not appear to have been massively influential. The other known early copy of the Honorius Ritual at the British Library does not appear to be directly dependent upon it. There are one or two other extant copies of the Summa that appear to be copied in the 16th century. One, a German translation, actually, that someone concealed behind a title page which identified it as a copy of the Arbitel, in fact. The other copy being just some fragments that were appended to a copy of the Liber Azielis. Gannel's name pops up a handful of times up through the 16th century, including in Trithemius's Antipalus Maleficorum. So I guess needless to say, Trithemius was not a fan. But otherwise, it seems like the SSM has only really re-entered scholarly and practitioner discourse since the manuscript itself was rediscovered in the 1960s.
Wow. So this is fascinating because there are, fresh eyes being put on this manuscript in the larger kind of grimoire renaissance that we find ourselves in the last 20 years or so. And I think this leads, Brian, to another listener question for you from Ted Orville, who is asking, are you, Brian, planning on translating other portions of the SSM?
I don't have any concrete plans right now. I have, in fact, translated a number of other short chapters and bits and pieces, mostly when I was in the early stages of just kind of exploring the whole text and trying to get a feel for the language and the handwriting, that kind of thing. But nothing that would really bear publication out of context. But that said, I certainly am not ruling it out if I, have the time and inclination again at some point in the future, and another chapter title catches my eye.
This kind of goes as well, Brian, to you're always working on something. There's always some research or some project that you're working on. Can you give us any hints or any indications on what you might be working on next?
I do have a few translations and some associated research in the pipeline, which should all hopefully be appearing at various points in the not too distant future. Recently, among other things, a colleague and I have been looking at how certain pre-Reformation, what you might call folk eschatological ideas, were preserved in some of the early modern grimoires. I can't say too much specifically about this project right now, but I am very excited about that project.
So are we, Brian. We'll definitely be keeping our ear to the ground on that. For all the listeners out there, can you just share a little bit about, where people can find you? You're also a freelance editor and a writer. Just anything else that you would like to add about either the SSM or how people can follow your work?
My, main public-facing internet presence is mostly Twitter. I'm at JOHBRI. There's also my professional website if people want to contact me about any translation or editing work. That's bjohnsonfreelance.com. There's also a page on there that has links to all of my work and also various tabletop role-playing game publications that I've mostly been the editor on. I'm just excited to get this out there and hear how people have been using it.
There's also a really great appearance on the Brian and Eric podcast, Brian and Eric Don't Belong Here, where I believe they chat with you as well. So that's also awesome.
Yes, and I can let you know that they are big fans of your show.
That is awesome. They are so fantastic as well. So we'll certainly make sure to link to that. And Brian, I am a huge fan of them, and I'm also a huge fan of you. Brian Johnson, translator, transcriber, humanities scholar, a freelance editor and writer, chatting about his latest tome from Hadean Press, Naming the Heavens, Orations from the Summa Sacra Magicae. Brian, thank you just so much for taking the time and stopping on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
It's always a pleasure, and as always, thank you for having me.
Listeners, definitely check out the podcast and video descriptions to get your own copy of Naming the Heavens and also checking out some of the other show notes. A huge thanks to Brian Johnson for sharing more about this incredibly important grimoire, the Summa Sacra Magicae, or SSM, and its massive influence and relationship to other grimoires like the Sworn Book of Honorius and the influence that it had on grimoires in the future. For any magician needing a concise handbook of names and poetic invocations, this is, to me, a critical addition to any mage's library. So thanks so much for Brian for taking his time and sharing his expertise. And also, a huge thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon. If you're willing to put up with massive amounts of nerdiness from some of the smartest esotericists, listeners, and practitioners ever, and if you like exclusive perks and to ask upcoming guests questions, please consider becoming a Glitch Bottle patron on patreon.com/glitchbottle. As always, this is Alexander F. reminding you to uncork the uncommon, name the heavens, and keep the light.